I know you guys are familiar with these two movies, Limitless and Lucy. And if you haven't watched them at all, or if you are not familiar with them at all, don't worry. Let me give you a sneak peek so that you are not left behind during this presentation.
Yes?
Professor Norman, my name's Lucy. I just read all your research on the human brain. It's a little rudimentary, but you're on the right track.
Thank you.
I have access to 28% of my cerebral capacity. I can feel every living thing.
Since when did you start writing Chinese?
Since an hour ago.
What happens when she reaches 100%?
I have no idea.
You know how they say that we can only access 20% of our brain? This lets you access all of it. They've had clinical trials and it's FDA approved.
All right, just out of curiosity, and that's all. I was blind, but now I see. A tablet a day, and I was limitless. I now had cultural appetites.
Since when do you speak Italian?
I finished my book in 4 days.
I'd like to renegotiate my advance.
Math became useful.
From 12,000 to 2.3 million in 10 days.
I'm baffled by this guy. So, Eddie Mora, you do know you're a freak. What's your secret?
Medication.
It happens that in both movies, the individuals have extraordinary capabilities that normal human beings do not possess. They underwent some changes in their brain, whatever might have led to those changes in their brain. I have no copy. Maybe their brain went through some sort of a hypertrophy. Maybe their brain cells proliferated. Maybe their brain cells multiplied and gave them these extraordinary capabilities. I have no copy. Or maybe they gained access to the dormant parts of the brain. It is said that we only use 10% of our brains, and the remaining 90% is just lying there dormantly, not in use. Maybe these individuals gained access to the dormant parts of our brains. This is where Morgan Freeman comes in, because he was featured in one of the movies. Maybe he has a better understanding or better explanation for this. We have heard from his side. It's now time to hear from my side. My argument is scientific based. Of all the publications I read, they described this as a myth. There is no scientific evidence to back up these claims that we use 10%. There is no scientific information that says that 90% of our brains are just lying there dormant. But anyway, let's not dispute their argument because they are not here to defend themselves. Maybe they did a study and I'm the only one who has not landed on it. It would have been better if you had Morgan Freeman himself here in person to tell us where he got his hypothesis from. You may not know, there is a saying in Swahili that goes like this: Lisemwalo lipo. Good luck in finding the meaning. In order for us to visualize the brain, we use imaging modalities such as a CT scan, which are oblique X-ray slices that show the density of the brain structures. MRI is another modality. Magnetic resonance imaging uses changes in magnetic fields and radioactive waves to produce 2 or 3-dimensional images of structures of the brain without using radioactive traces or ionizing radiation. Others are functional MRI, functional imaging ultrasound, and PET scans, optical diffuse imaging, and so on. So today's scientists may look at these imaging modalities and have a big laugh. They don't just see dormant areas in the brain lying there, not in use. But wait, these imaging modalities just help us to visualize those structures. How are we sure if those structures are really in use? Kudos to science for inventing these imaging modalities. They help us see the structures of the brain. But we are not convinced that these structures, all of them, are in use. To support my argument that human beings don't have just dormant parts in their brain lying there not in use, let's look at the structure of the brain. The brain is a complex organ that controls thought, memory, emotion, touch, motor skills, vision, breathing, temperature, hunger, and processes that regulate our body. This is the organ that makes us different from other animals. This sophisticated organ, one of the most complex structures that even human beings themselves understand less about it. The brain weighs about 1.5 kilograms and makes up about 2% of the human body weight. The cerebrospinal fluid suspends it in neutral buoyancy to a weight of about 25 grams. The brain is protected within the skull and it's composed of 3 main parts. These are the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. This amazing structure receives information through our five senses: the sight, smell, touch, taste, and hearing. The information is assembled in a way that has meaning to us and can store the information in our memory provided we still alive and our brain is not affected by a certain pathology. The brain forms part of the central nervous system together with the spinal cord. We said it's divided in three parts. Let's break them down. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, composed of our right and left hemispheres. Each hemisphere has four lobes divided by fissures. The two hemispheres of the brain are separated by the greater longitudinal fissure and joined at the bottom by the corpus callosum, and delivers messages from one half of the brain to the other. Each lobe may be divided into areas that serve very specific functions. Each lobe does not function alone. Let's begin with the frontal lobe. This is responsible for judgment, planning, problem solving, personality, behavior, emotions, speech and writing, which is carried out by this specific area called the Broca's area. Body movement, intelligence, concentration, self-awareness. The temporal lobe helps you understand language, and the specific area responsible for this function is called the Wernicke's area. It's also responsible for hearing, memory, organization and sequencing. Parietal lobe, responsible for interpreting language, words, spatial and visual perception, sense of touch, pain, temperature, interprets signals from vision, hearing, motor and sensory functions, and memory. And lastly, the occipital, responsible for interpretation of vision information, color, light, movement. The other major part of the brain is the cerebellum, located just beneath the cerebrum. Major structure of the hindbrain and is the largest structure of the hindbrain. It makes up about 10% of the total volume of the brain, yet it contains an estimated 50% to 80% of the brain's neurons. There are two main parts of the cerebellum: cerebellar cortex, a layer containing folded tissue containing most of the cerebellum's neurons; cerebellar nuclei, the innermost part of the cerebellum containing nerve cells that communicate information from the cerebellum. What are the functions? Coordinating the body's voluntary movement, helps organize all actions of the muscle groups involved in particular movement. For example, walking, running, throwing a ball, and even eye movement. It's also responsible for mental functions. Researchers believe the cerebellum plays a role in thinking, including processing language and mood, as well as attention, fear response, and pleasure or reward response. Balance and posture is also another function. Effects of alcohol on the cerebellum can become visible when one develops ataxia or loss of coordination. Movement is impaired. Those who are intoxicated might find that they cannot even walk in a straight line or even touch their own nose as instructed. Motor learning is another function. When you learn to perform a new skill such as riding a bike or hitting a baseball, you often go through a trial and error process. As you fine-tune your motor movements, you eventually become better, able to perform the skill. Eventually, you can perform the action seamlessly. So the cerebellum plays a critical role in these processes. The brainstem. This is the posterior stalk-like part of the brain that connects the cerebrum with the spinal cord, composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Makes up around 2.6% of the brain's total weight. 10 pairs of cranial nerves come from the brainstem. Three main parts of the brainstem. Let's begin with the midbrain. Is the forwardmost part of the brainstem and is associated with vision, hearing, motor control, sleep and wakefulness, arousal, and temperature regulation. In the rostral direction, the midbrain noticeably splays laterally. Let's look at the tectum. This is the dorsal side of the midbrain. It is involved in certain reflexes in response to visual or auditory stimuli. Input from the tectum travels both rostrally and caudally via the reticulospinal tract, which also exerts some control over alertness. The corpora quadrigemina forms molds called colliculi in two pairs, superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi processes some visual information and decussation of several fibers of the optic nerve and are involved in saccadic eye movements. There is also the tectospinal tract that connects the superior colliculi to cervical nerves of the neck and coordinates head and eye movements. The inferior colliculi, located just above trochlear nerve, and processes certain auditory information. The cerebral aqueduct, which is also part of the ventricular system that links the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle and is responsible for continuing the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. It is surrounded by the periaqueductal grid, which has a role in analgesia, quiescence, and bonding. The dorsal raphe nucleus, which releases serotonin in response to certain neural activity. The tegmentum, portion of the midbrain ventral to cerebral aqueduct, and is much larger in size than the tectum, communicates with the cerebellum by superior cerebellar peduncles. The main bulk of our tegmentum contains a complex synaptic network of our neurons primarily involved in homeostasis and reflex action, and a number of distinct nerve tracts between other parts of the brain pass through. The area between the red nuclei of the ventral side, called the ventrotegmental area, is the largest dopamine-producing area in the brain and is heavily involved in neural reward system. And the ventrotegmental area is in contact with the parts of the forebrain. Cerebral peduncles, they form a lobe ventrally of the tegmentum on either sides of the midline. Beyond the midbrain, between the lobes, is the interpeduncular fossa, which is a cistern filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Majority of each lobe constitutes the cerebral crus. The cerebral crus are the main tracts descending from the thalamus to caudal parts of the central nervous system. The central and the medial ventral portions contain the corticobulbar and corticospinal tracts, while the remainder of each crus primarily contains tracts connecting the cortex to the pons. The portion of the lobes in connection with the tegmentum, except the most lateral portion, is dominated by a blackened band. The substantia nigra, also called the black substance, is the only part of the basal ganglia system out of the forebrain. It is involved in motor planning, learning, addiction, and other functions. The pons and the brainstem lies between the medulla oblongata and the midbrain, separated from the midbrain by the superior pontine sulcus, and forms the medulla by the inferior pontine sulcus. Contains tracts carrying signals from the cerebrum to the medulla and to the cerebellum, and also tracts carrying sensory signals to the thalamus. The pons is connected to the cerebellum by the cerebellar peduncle, houses the respiratory, pneumotaxic center, and aponeustic center. The medulla oblongata, the point where the brainstem connects to the spinal cord, contains nucleus called the nucleus of the solitary tract that is crucial for our survival, receives information about blood flow, along with information about levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood from the heart and major blood vessels. When this information suggests discordance with bodily needs, for example, blood pressure is too low, there are reflexive actions initiated in the nucleus of the solitary tract to bring things back to within the desired range. Essential to our survival because it ensures that a vital system, for example, cardiovascular and respiratory systems, are working properly. The medulla contains cardiac, dorsal, and ventral respiratory groups and vasomotor centers dealing with heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure. Another important medullary structure is the area postroma, whose functions include the control of vomiting. Let's dig deeper and see more functions of the brain and more structures of the brain. The brain is divided into right and left brain and are joined by the corpus callosum that transmit messages from one side to the other. Each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. We call this decussation. Not all functions of the hemisphere are shared. In general, the left hemisphere controls speech comprehension, arithmetic, and writing. The right side controls creativity, spatial ability, artistic, and musical skills. The left hemisphere is dominant in hand use and language in about 92% of people. Hence, it is called the dominant hemisphere. In about a third of the people who are left-handed, speech function may be located in the right side, so they may need special testing to determine if the speech center is on the left or right side prior to any surgery in that area. Disruption of language or disturbance is called aphasia, and the type of aphasia depends on the area affected. Let's look at these important areas. The Broca's area located in the left frontal lobe. Damage to this area may lead to Broca's aphasia, may be characterized by difficulty in moving the tongue or facial muscles to produce sounds of speech. The person can read, understand spoken language, but difficulty in speaking and writing. Another important area that lies in the left temporal lobe is the Wernicke's area. Damage to this area causes a Wernicke's aphasia. The person may make speech in long sentences that have no meaning. In the necessary words, they can make speech sounds, however, they have difficulties in understanding speech and are therefore unaware of their mistakes. The cortex of the brain, this is the surface of the brain folded. The peak is called gyrus or gyri in plural, and the trough is called sulcus or sulci in plural, and the process is called gyrification. The cortex contains 16 billion neurons that are arranged in specific layers. The cortex is the ultimate control and information processing center in the brain. It is responsible for functions such as sensation, perception, memory, association, thought, and voluntary physical action. The nerve cell colors the cortex gray-brown, giving its name, the gray matter. Beneath the cortex are long nerve fibers called axons that connect the brain areas to each other, called white matter. The folding of the cortex increases the brain surface area, allowing more neurons to sit inside the skull and enabling higher function. Deeper structures of the brain, pathways called white matter tracks, connect areas of the cortex to each other. Messages can travel from one gyrus to another, from one lobe to another, and to structures deeper in the brain. Let's begin with the hypothalamus, located in the floor of the third ventricle and is the master control of the autonomic nervous system. It's the gland in your brain that controls your hormone system. It releases hormones to another part of your brain called the pituitary gland, which sends the hormones out of your brain to different organs to regulate various homeostatic functions, plays a role in controlling behaviors such as hunger, thirst, sleep, and sexual response. It also regulates body temperature, blood pressure, and emotions, plus secretions of hormones, which we had earlier mentioned. Some of these hormones include corticotropin-releasing hormone, dopamine, growth hormone-releasing hormone, somatostatin, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and thyrotropin-releasing hormone. Let's look at the pituitary gland. It lies in a small pocket of the bone at the skull base called the sella tussica. It's connected to the hypothalamus by pituitary stalk. Because it controls other endocrine glands in the body, it's known as the master gland. It secretes hormones that control sexual development, promotes bone and muscle growth, and respond to stress. The pituitary has two main parts, the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland, also called the adenohypophysis, releases hormones upon releasing or inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. These hypothalamic hormones tell the anterior lobe whether to release more or specific hormone or stop production of the hormone. Anterior lobe hormones include adrenocorticotropic hormone, abbreviated as ACTH, which stimulates the adrenal glands to release hormones. Follicle-stimulating hormones, which work with luteinizing hormone to ensure normal functioning of the ovaries and testes. Growth hormones, abbreviated as GH, essential in early years to maintaining a healthy body composition and for growing in children. In adults, it aids healthy bones and muscle mass and affects fat distribution. Luteinizing hormone, abbreviated as LH, work with the follicle-stimulating hormone to ensure normal functioning of the ovaries and testes. Prolactin stimulates milk production. Thyroid-stimulating hormone, TSH, stimulates thyroid gland to produce hormones. The posterior lobe, also called the neurohypophysis, contains the ends of the nerve cell communicating from the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sends hormones directly to the posterior lobe via the nerves, and then pituitary gland releases them. Posterior lobe hormones include antidiuretic hormones, abbreviated as ADH, which prompts the kidneys to increase water absorption in the blood. Oxytocin, involved in various processes such as contracting the uterus during childbirth and stimulating production of breast milk. The thalamus serves as a relay center for information that comes and goes to the cortex. It plays a role in pain sensation, attention, alertness, and memory. The basal ganglia includes the caudate putamen and the globus pallidus. This nuclei works with the cerebellum to coordinate fine motions such as fingertip movements. Limbic system, center for emotions, learning, and memory. Included in this system are cingulate gyri, hypothalamus, amygdala, which is responsible for emotional reactions, and hypothalamus for memory. Memory is included in three phases: encoding, which is deciding what information is important; storing and recalling. There are different types of memory, so your brain has to pay attention and rehearse in order for an event to move from a short-term to long-term memory, which we call encoding. Short-term memory, also called a working memory, occurs in the prefrontal cortex, stores information for about 1 minute, and its capacity is limited to about 7 items. For example, it enables you to dial a phone number someone just told you. It also intervenes during reading to memorize the sentence you just read so that the next one makes sense. Long-term memory is processed in the hippocampus of the temporal lobe and is activated when you want to memorize something for a longer time. This memory has unlimited content and duration capacity. Skill memory is processed in the cerebellum, which relays information to the basal ganglia. It stores automatic learned memories like tying a shoe, playing an instrument, and riding a bike. The brain has a hollow fluid-filled cavities called ventricles. Inside the ventricles is a ribbon-like structure, colloid plexus, that makes cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid helps cushion the brain from injury. There are two ventricles deep in the cerebral hemisphere called the lateral ventricles. They both connect with the third ventricle through an opening called foramen of Monroe. The third ventricle connects to the fourth through a long narrow tube called the aqueduct of Sylvius. From the fourth ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid flows into the subarachnoid space, where it bathes and cushions the brain. Let's look at the skull. Serves to protect the brain from injury, formed from 8 bones that fuse together along suture lines. These are frontal, parietal, temporal, sphenoid, occipital, and ethmoid bones. There are also cranial nerves that, along with the spinal cord, the brain communicates with the body. They are 12 in pairs. 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves that control hearing, eye movement, facial sensation, taste, swallowing, and movement of face, neck, shoulder, and tongue muscles originate from the brainstem. Ones responsible for smell and vision originate in the cerebrum. These nerves are olfactory, which is cranial nerve number 1, responsible for smell. Optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2 for sight. Oculomotor, cranial nerve number 3, moves the eye and the pupil. And then trochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve number 4, moves the eye. Cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal nerve, responsible for face sensation. Cranial nerve number 6, abducens, moves the eye. Cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve, moves the face and responsible for salivation. Cranial nerve number 8, vestibulocochlear nerve, responsible for hearing and balance. Cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal, responsible for taste and swallowing. Cranial nerve number 10, which is the vagus, responsible for heart rate and digestion. Cranial nerve number 11, the accessory nerve, moves the head. And then lastly, cranial nerve number 12, hypoglossal nerve, which moves the tongue. Let's look at the meninges. The brain and the spinal cord are covered and protected by 3 layers of the tissue, which are called meninges. These layers are the pia mater, which hugs the surface of the brain following its folds and grooves. It has many blood vessels that reach deep into the brain. The space between the pia mater and the next layer, called the arachnoid mater, is called the subarachnoid space. It is where the cerebrospinal fluid bathes and cushions the brain. Arachnoid mater is the second layer, thin web-like membrane that covers the entire brain. The arachnoid is made up of elastic tissue. The space between the arachnoid mater and the next level, called the dura mater, is called space. Then lastly, we have the dura mater. It's a strong, thick membrane that closely lines the inside of the skull. Its 2 layers, the peristyle and the meningeal dura, are fused and separated only to form venous sinuses. The dura creates little folds or compartments. These are 2 special dural folds, the falx and the tentorium. The falx separates the right and the left hemispheres of the brain, and the tentorium separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. We also have blood vessels that supply the brain tissue with oxygen and nutrients, and also carry away waste products from the brain tissues. So this sophisticated organ has many structures, and we cannot finish talking about them. So these are the main structures that we have just. After taking a closer look at the parts of the brain and the functions of those parts, we haven't seen any part that is just lying there dormantly, not in use. At least every part is occupied. So where did this teaching come from, or where did the hypothesis come from? Motivation speakers have been promoting this since early 1907 as a way to encourage people to tap into some latent capacity. They want to push an idea that we haven't fully achieved our potential. This proclamation is not based on sound science. Someone may ask, I've heard of people who sustain head injuries, head seizures, struck by lightning or electrocuted, develop abilities they never possessed before. Like someone becomes good at solving mathematical problems. Someone becomes efficient at playing a piano. Someone develops an art in music. Does it mean that the injuries help them unlock parts of the brain they had no access to, or that had not been exploited before? That's a good question. Why do people become sudden geniuses after head injuries? There is mounting evidence that brain damage can unlock creative talents. What can this teach us about how sudden geniuses are made? It is possible that these people underwent sudden seventh syndrome, in which exponential abilities emerge after brain injury or a disease. But this is rare. There are about 25 cases reported on this planet. A good example is Tony Chicoria, an orthopedic surgeon who was struck by lightning in New York in the year 1994. It went straight through his head, leaving him with irresistible desire to play a piano. To begin with, he used to play other people's music, but soon he started writing down the melodies that were constantly running through his head. Right now, he's a pianist, composer, as well as a practicing orthopedic surgeon.
I did have an exposure to piano at age 7 when my mother insisted that I take piano lessons at age 7, and I hated it, so I never would comply, and eventually she gave up. And so I really didn't know anything about piano or classical piano to fill a thimble. But suddenly I had this incredible desire to hear it, and it was so strong that I was moved to drive all the way to Albany, an hour away, to get a CD of classical piano music. And the CD just kind of jumped off the shelf into my hands, and it was Vladimir Ashkenazy playing his favorite Chopin. I was so smitten with the music, I couldn't stop listening to it. I made my family listen to it. I made everybody at work listen to it. It played all the time.
So how does this happen? According to the article I read, entitled The Mystery of How Sudden Geniuses Are Made, the article said that this might have two leading ideas. First, when you're bashed on the head, the effects are similar to those of lysergic acid dithylamine, which is a hallucinogenic drug. It belongs to a class of drugs called psychedelics. These drugs are thought to enhance creativity by increasing the levels of serotonin, which is the feel-good hormone. This leads to synesthesia, whereby more than one region of the brain is simultaneously activated, and the senses that were separated become linked. When the brain becomes injured, the dead and dying cells leak serotonin into the surrounding tissues. This encourages new connections, just like in psychedelic drugs. Second theory is based on the functions of the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. According to a Nobel Prize-winning research, these two hemispheres specialize in different tasks, whereby you find that the right hemisphere is home for creativity and the left hemisphere is a center for logic and language. But the left side is something of a bully. It tends to be the dominant side of the brain. It tends to suppress very marginal type of thinking, highly creative thinking, because it's beneficial for our decision-making abilities and abilities to function in normal life. Theory states that if the left side is damaged, then the right side is left to flourish. What about mainstream geniuses? Let's consider autism. It has been estimated that 1 in 10 people with autism have seventh syndrome, and there's mounting evidence that this is associated with enhanced creativity. Though hard to prove, it has been speculated that intellectual giants such as Einstein, Darwin, Mozart, Michelangelo, Newton were on the spectrum. Other theories suggest that autism arises as a result of abnormal levels of serotonin in the left hemisphere during childhood. This prevents the region from developing normally, allowing the right hemisphere to become more active. Many people with seventh syndrome develop symptoms of autism, including social problems, all-consuming interest, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. You guys might have heard or come across this word, plasticity. By the mention of the word plasticity, one can conclude that we are talking about plastics, but this is kind of different because we are talking about the brain. So just as the plastic or a plastic can be molded from one form to another, brain cells can adapt from one function to another, and we call this neuroplasticity. The brain's ability to change or adapt as a result of our experience. The brain has billions of neurons, about 86 billion, and it has this remarkable capacity to reorganize pathways, create new connections, and even create new neurons in some cases. There are two types of plasticity: functional plasticity, where functions move from damaged areas of the brain to undamaged areas of the brain. Then there's structural plasticity, where the brain is able to change its structure as a result of learning. Plasticity helps the brain learn new things, enhance existing cognitive capabilities, recover from stroke and brain injuries, strengthening areas where functions may be lost or have declined, improvements that strengthen or promote brain fitness. When we were young, we had lots of neurons, but as we grew up, we gained new experiences. So those connections and neurons which we used more frequently were enhanced, but those which we rarely used were eliminated. In science, we refer to this as synaptic pruning. And also brain exposure to certain environmental events such as sensory stimuli, hormones, drugs, diet and stress may influence brain development in a different way. So plasticity helps to enhance certain functions. So if you develop certain capabilities, maybe as a result of plasticity, not that you have unlocked some dormant area in your brain. What about brain boosters? What do they do to our brains? From the articles I read, they say that these drugs don't actually perform what they claim to. There's no evidence that they improve memory, cognition, or brain health. What these pills do, they improve alertness. They give you energy for you to concentrate or focus more, change mood, or help you remember. No pills can make you a genius if you ain't one. Most people realize that they are more focused, they are alert, they are motivated, that they are processing information faster. Some have tried and have gotten the benefits, but others, they have not noticed anything. Brain boosters may appear to be stimulants, but they are not stimulants in a strict sense, such as things like caffeine, ephedrine, and amphetamine are. So in many cases, no one really knows how they act on the brain. Some studies have shown actually that some supplements are good for brain health, but they do not make geniuses. Omega-3 fatty acids, also called fish oil, helps to build the membranes in the brain and also may contain antioxidants and anti-inflammatory effects that may protect brain cells. And also some studies have linked higher intake of fish in your diet with a decreased risk of cognitive decline. If you want to improve your brain health, consider including fish in your diet.
Vitamin E. Vitamin E is an antioxidant, and it is believed that it helps in brain health by reducing oxidative stress, and is the only supplement that has been found to have any possible benefits. Studies have found out that high intake of vitamin E in patients with mild to moderate Alzheimer's continue to perform their daily life functions for a shorter period of time, but it doesn't prevent the disease or reduce the symptoms. Vitamin B. 3 B vitamins are always in line with brain health. These are vitamin B6, vitamin B9, and vitamin B12. They help break down homocysteine and amino acid associated with Alzheimer's and dementia in high concentration. And also B vitamins help to produce energy that is used to in development of new brain cells.
What about herbs? Herbs for thought. Recent researchers have focused on ginkgo biloba leaves, native to China and one of the oldest plants on this planet Earth. This herb is particularly interesting to researchers because of its potential to treat Alzheimer's and age-related mental decline. Several studies have shown that it does help in these conditions, and it's routinely prescribed in places like Germany and France. It's believed that ginkgo works by thinning blood and thereby increasing oxygen supply to the brain tissues. It's a brain booster in people with normal mental abilities. Remains controversial. Huperzine. Huperzine is another herb and is derived from a Chinese moss called the Huperzia serrata. Studies have shown that it has potentials of Alzheimer's therapy, and also it may be used as a brain booster in healthy people, but a few studies have shown that it appears to block an enzyme responsible for breaking down acetylcholine, and the more acetylcholine stays in the brain, the more it can be helpful in memory. What if you could remember everything? As this may sound good, be glad that you can forget, because if you can't forget, you'll keep on remembering the bad stuffs, and this may affect you in a certain kind of way. That aside, did you know that there are people who can literally remember every single detail in their life? These people can remember every day of their life in near perfect detail. They do it flawlessly, from news, events, conversations to what they had had for breakfast. No matter how far removed, if prompted with appropriate date, these people are able to retrieve appropriate folder from their mental cabinet without hesitation. I came across this condition when I was watching a video on a UK-based channel called Real Stories. They had published a video 5 years ago entitled The Boy Who Can't Forget. I believe the boy was called Aurelian Heyman. And in that documentary, it happens that there are other few individuals who also have or who also suffer from the same condition.
Aurelian is the first British man to say that he doesn't forget his past.
Because I remember the 25th being the day where it snowed in the morning, and I think it was the day that George Best died.
7th of July, 2008.
It's a Monday. It just seems like there's just no gaps at all. I can just see it all.
Around the world, other people have come forward. Some claim to remember every day of their life.
Bing, 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 bing. If you could stick a camera in my head, then I think everybody would freak out.
October 13th, 1980.
Was a Monday.
How do you know it's a Monday?
Because I just do.
Celebrities like Mary Lou also have the same capabilities.
With actress Mary Lou Henner, who has a rare ability to recall specific details from everyday life. It's called highly superior autobiographical memory.
Right.
Otherwise known as HSAM.
HSAM. We call it ourselves HSAMers.
Highly superior.
It happens that these individuals have a condition known as hyperthymesia. So what happens in hyperthymesia? Much is not known about the cause, but there are some theories to what contributes to hyperthymesia, but the exact cause is not known. Some researchers suggest that the causes may be genetic, biological, or psychological. However, more studies are needed in order to understand what really causes hyperthymesia. The biological theory states that people with hyperthymesia may have increased activity in certain parts of the brain, for example, the amygdala, and also it also states that people with hyperthymesia may have increased activity in different parts of the brain, for example, the inferior and superior parietal lobe. When it comes to genetics, studies are ongoing to find out if the ability has a genetic basis. The theory that hyperthymesia is psychological states that people with hyperthymesia obsessively think about previous experiences. So regularly thinking about these events help them to strengthen their ability to recall. So as such, people with hyperthymesia preserve their memories. That is it, guys. Thanks for sticking around. And if someone tells you that we only use 10% of our brains, please refer him to this video. Stay happy and safe wherever you are, and let me meet you in the next one.